Be careful whose messes you clean up. When I was 20, I took a job to earn some pocket money while making up for my earlier underachievements at my local community college. My new employer was one of those full-service residential cleaning companies. I won't say which one to protect the innocent, but let's just call it cleanbro. I was one of those people who worked the mops for cleanbro, and, well, for 20-year-old punks who spent the high school years in the bottom of a bong like myself, and for those 40-year-old losers who didn't care how dirty it got during the day, so as long as they could afford to wash themselves with cheap beer at night. There were plenty of upstanding folks in the profession, mind you, but they tended to sign for the companies that cared more about their employees' work ethic and less about the documentation that came up standards for being born here. Unlike the competition, cleanbro exclusively hired dropouts and burnouts because, well, we work for pennies, and because corporate didn't seem to have a knack for attracting government scrutiny. For both groups, and then cleaning up after people's messes was something to do while running away from our own. Everyone came for the job from somewhere more or less than ideal. And folks left it for pastures that were far no greener. Cleanup jobs they came in a pretty wide variety. The most common was picking up after a kitchen fire. Some sleep-deprived stay-at-home mom decided she would put dinner on the stove and then nod off on the couch. The smoke alarm would blare and the kids would be given a good fright, but everybody would make it out safe. The fire department hosed it down with gray water, leaving behind a colossal mess of smoke-stained ceilings, waterlogged drywall, shattered glass, and smashed dishware. Once the claims adjuster had taken his look, the homeowner could just call cleanbro. I'd roll up in my company van, company overalls, spend the day scrubbing off windows and prying up cracked tile and sucking ashes into the most powerful shop vac. The next day, the carpenters would swoop in and put the whole thing back together, better than new sometimes. With the insurance policies, half these houses had nicer kitchens by the time it was all said and done, and I'd usually get a pretty good tip for my troubles after all, so I wasn't complaining much. Some of the cleaners refused to work anything other than a fire rehab or a flood restoration, but as a young fellow, I like to think I could stomach anything, so I ended up taking a lot of the worst jobs. For example, a couple of weeks ago, cleanbro got a call for work at a suicide scene. Now, it's not as bad as you think. By the time I pull up, the coroner had already picked up the body, and the cops had asked their questions, and the forensic teams had scraped together whatever evidence they were able to get. At that point, the homeowner was usually left a little more worse than some bad memories and a stain. It was my job to scrub out the stain. The more considerate ones hardly left any mess at all, choosing a bathtub for their final resting place or before cutting their wrist or swallowing a handful of pills. Sometimes there would be a dark rain revealing the tub's last high water mark. Usually there was no sign of all that was happening there, but still, the homeowner would normally have me pull out the tub entirely, leaving behind a hole till they fill in with something new. I guess they didn't really like the idea of showering or bathing the same place where a loved one lay dead for and decaying for, hours? Days? Maybe even weeks sometimes. They hired me because in my area, a regular contractors won't touch that tub, and it's had a dead body in it. Owing occupational health hazard risk and regulations, but as a cleanbro cleaner, I had all the necessary training and safety girl to touch dirty things. Some of the dead were a lot less polite. Folks who went in bed included a lot of elderly types taking the natural way out. They left a pretty big mess in the sheets and a mattress from the various liquids that tend to exit the body upon death. Blood, vomit were pretty common from the cutters and overdosers, respectively, I mind you. The cleanup involving a little more than wrapping up everything in a plastic bag and holding it down for a proper biohazardous waste disposal. A service cleanbro provided for a reasonable fee, after all. And then there were the really, really rude people who decided to swallow a bullet because it's quick. They tend to take the longest to mop. I'll spare you the details beyond that. Worse than the mess itself was the 1,000-yard stare at the face of the spouse or parent who had the misfortune of discovering the body and seeing their loved ones in that state. You just know those people are never going to be the same again. Now, if all of that makes you reconsider your professional choices for a cleanup duty, perhaps you'll think about it when I tell you this tale. I had been working for cleanbro for about a year, and I got sent a job one early morning. My boss didn't give me details as usual, just the work address and the work order. Go the phase of a basement deep clean, telling me someone would explain it to me when I got there. Vague instructions were always a bad sign. I picked up one of the boxy cleanbro vans with a full set of gear and then headed out. The place was hard to find, tucked off a back road of the woods and edge of town, and the satellite navigation was barely a thing yet, let alone GPS-enabled smartphones, after all. After making a few wrong turns, I figured I was in the wrong place when one of my fellow cleaners, Kurt, was sitting in the driveway with his beater Civic. It wasn't unusual for folks to get called straight from home to work a rush job on their day off. Kurt was that other kind of cleanbro cleaner, the 40-year burnout kind. Fortunately, he was reasonably reliable, preferring to stay sober at least until the job was nearly done. He was smoking a cigarette, while some slick 30-something in a suit holding a binder, shouting and waving excitedly at him. I recognized the guy. A real estate agent for a local bank that often hired cleanbro to make foreclosures presentable before putting them on the market. Those jobs, they weren't the worst, even though there was regularly any blood and gore. Instead, to deal with the knee-deep residue of evicted hoarders, or work without lights, running water during a drug addicts that had ripped out the wires and plumbing to sell for scrap, or the risk of getting shot by a disgruntled ex-homeowner looking to exact revenge on some poor schmuck that was standing on his property at the behest of that fucking bank. I was almost relieved when I recognized the house was a different case entirely. About 6 months earlier, it came to light that a bunch of disappearances throughout the state had been work of some local psycho that has been using his basement as a obtuar. The Evening News had a shot of the killer's house, introducing a couple Weeks of nightly updates. Such a normal fellow, his neighbors would say to the cameras. So clean, they said. I had been with cleanbro for a few months at the time of reports, and made me wonder if I had learned enough about removing stains to make a murder scene vanish completely. But by now, I was a pro. Maybe this wouldn't be such a big job after all. Besides, they'd already found the guy hanging from his basement ceiling, and at least there was no chance of him being their next lucky contestant in his sick game. The cops had gotten a break in the case when a student at the college dodged an attempted kidnapping. They released a pretty good sketch to kick off a statewide manhunt. The police had gotten some leads in the area, convincing the store clerks, whose stories were backed up by a grainy security video. They started canvassing the area. Someone found the front door standing open at nobody's home. And imagine they started peering through the windows and they spotted some probable cause. Once they realized they had stumbled across the cops, must have figured their suspect opted for the literal news or the figurative one that was drawing tight around him. The real estate agent spun around when he heard my van pulling up in a secluded driveway and flashed a relief before turning his red agitation. He was already yelling at me before I had the van in park, squeezing between Kurt's Civic and a silver coupe that screamed self-indulgent prick. I calmly stepped out of the van and began to unload the gear, and he blattered on about having booked this weeks ago, something about open house in 2 days, and something about lawsuits, and something about hard-working, red-blooded Americans instead of these lazy goddamn immigrants. And I got here as soon as you were called, sir. We'll work as quickly as we can, pal. Way my head above my pay grade, guy. Go fuck yourself, I didn't say. The real estate agent led me and Kurt over to this masonry exterior steps through the front door, down the hall, into the kitchen where the entrance to the basement was. He tried the knob, which turned, but of course the door was stuck. And this guy didn't really want to be there, and I couldn't wait to see him go either. I was about to volunteer to try, but when Kurt spoke up, "Here, let me see if I can get that door for you, sir." He said that in a way a long life service slob like Kurt could literally respect while implying his deepest loathings imaginable. The agent seemed to inordinately be relieved as he stepped back all the way to the entrance of the kitchen, as if he was ready to sprint back to his Audi. I indistinctly breathed myself as Kurt gave the door a good single sharp shove, just in the right spot, popping it free and releasing the unholiest smell imaginable. I reeled back, my eyes watering, my stomach and throat fighting over which direction my half-digested breakfast was meant to go. I kept it down and blinked away the tears as I heard Kurt wheezing for breath through his tobacco-stained lungs. For a moment I invited his burnout sinuses, since he seemed to only barely be phased, while I was on the verge of passing out. Before I could fully recover, the agent snapped that we'd be out tomorrow by 10, in time for the house stagers to arrive and turn the basement cesspit into a cozy game room or some shit. And then, with an audible bark, of the 4 turbocharged cylinders, the real estate asshole was gone. Kurt and I put on our masks, which enormously helped smell. The HEPA filters pulled anything biohazardous out of the air, although you could smell something had died down there. I descended into the narrow basement, stepped down, and found a pull chain dangling from the ceiling. I gave it a good tug, and with a disappointment how little the effect it had. The killer had apparently decided to do his part by installing one of those new elliptical compact fluorescent light bulbs. That kind of thing that takes a while to warm up. In its greenish light combined with a dim morning sun filtering through a row of 6-inch high basement windows, the room looked pretty unremarkable. It was a gray concrete rectangle with a few round steel posts supporting the joists above. Kurt awkwardly passed a heavy lighting rig down the stairs to me, and I plunged it into an outlet in the wall, pumping 2,000 watts of halogen glory into the concrete room. I immediately wished it hadn't. Under the fluorescent lights, the floor had just been a great plain, but the room was full of shapeless gray furniture. Artificial sun revealed that I was in fact standing in a pool of dried blood that was nearly the size of the house's entire foundation, and there were tables and power tools around, anything too big to fit in an evidence bag, that were equally coated in what I could say was tiny bits of human remains. Again, I'll spare you the details. Suffice to say, I was glad that we had a full-body plastic bag suits to wear in this kind of job. It takes a long time to clean a mess this big, Kurt muttered as he reached the bottom of the stairs, turned slowly to take view. Kurt and I got to work. After a little while, I barely even noticed that the noxious smell leaking through my mask. We laid drop cloths to avoid tracking the gore around. We wrapped the soiled furniture and tools in the plastic bags and halted away. We found the bulkhead door near the backyard. It was padlocked shut, so we broke our backs with things up this narrow steps to the kitchen. Looking like a germophobic movers, we were emptied the basement into the front lawn. The day wore on, and we took our lunch break. A cleanbro disposal truck stopped by to pick up the large biocontaminated debris. The driver was a friend and had picked up some subs for us on her way here. Kurt scarfed them down. Bologna and American cheese on white. I didn't much have an appetite for my chicken parm, but when he finished eating, Kurt lit a marble red from his bright orange Zippo. It was in a surprisingly cheerful condition, despite being by far one of the nastiest calls I ever worked. He told me about all this in less than an illustrious career in cleanup. He had been cleaning for over 20 years in the worn overalls of half as many different companies throughout the region. I noticed nostalgia in his voice, making the biggest mess disappear gave him a kind of satisfaction that I, at that time, didn't quite muster. I'd never seen him so chatty, but I was content to actually let him talk himself out before I finally returned to the task at hand. We hit things hard after that, hoping that the job would be finished to come back with this back ass early next morning to make our fucking deadline. Our boss at cleanbro always showed appreciation when we made one of our bank clients happy, since he offered the toughest jobs but the most lucrative, naturally. All the big stuff was out, and there's a caked on blood we're starting to whir away under the industrial solvents we had deployed. Between opening the basement windows and setting up industrial fan blowing down from the top of the steps, we managed to get the worst of the fumes out. Mopping was sweaty work, and the hood's full and mask. I was starting to feel the week from skipping lunch, so we decided to take them off and risk the air. The smell was actually kind of tolerable by now. I did catch the occasional whiff of death from as the morning wore on. Naturally, the sun was setting as we started to wrap things up. Thanks to chemistry, mops, and old-fashioned elbow grease, the concrete floor was clean enough that you could probably eat off it, assuming that you had no idea of the horrible crimes that committed there. Anything else that had been soiled was either off the property or in the back of the van. Kurt and I nodded in agreement on a job well done, and then, just as I turned to haul off the first load of cleaning equipment back into the narrow basement steps, I heard a sharp pop above my head. I clipped the fluorescent light bulb with the mop handle, shattering into fine silver powder that drifted down just like snow. Working on the glow of fluorescent lights, I had completely forgotten it was there. Now, as if that wasn't enough reasons to hate these fucking compact lights. The damn things have mercury in them. They gets out dust and vapor, and when they even swatter. Most of these people just vacuum up the dust and broken glass without a thought, which is a great way to spread poison around your house. As a certified cleanup professional, I had both the training and sworn the duty to do the right thing in the situation, even if it kept me from going home an hour extra. Kurt smirked at me, shaking his head as he pulled out his HEPA mask back on. "That's all you," he said, grabbing his shop bag and hauling it up the stairs. I followed back to the van with a half-empty bucket of solvent and fetched my sticky lint roller with a fine broom and dustpan, a jar intended for hazardous chemical waste. Kurt packed up the rest of the equipment into the van while I performed the delicate duties of saving the world from a 10,000th of a gram of mercury. Needing in and out of the were my least favorite parts of the job. Even though it was Friday night and I didn't have much to go home to, so I was pretty slow about it. I timed it so I could finish up, and there was nothing left but to get the lighting rig. That was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay now that the sun was gone. I swept the fine flakes of the CFL into the jar, and then reached up to unscrew the wrecked light bulbs from the base of the fixture. Just in time, I remembered to tug and pull the chain off to switch it first. I was sealing off the jar's lid, and when I heard the snap of Kurt's Zippo, when I was admonishing him for smoking in a client's house, when I saw that he was using its light to look at something against the wall outside a smearing beam of a flood lamp. The better-preferred cleaners carried a pin light with them, but Kurt was more of a travel light kind of guy. He was poking at some antique furniture that the witness horrors escaped, and unstained. It was clean enough to sell to some deprived collector of serial killer's memorabilia, which we weren't meant to touch. It's bad form for a cleaner to snoop through a homeowner's property, but I guess the poor dead psychos wasn't going to mind. It looks like they missed one, Kurt said, getting out an amused whistle as he stared into the drawer, and he opened up conservation of cleanbro's policy. What? I asked, not sure I wanted to know. He held a severed finger in his nurturite gloved hand, giving me a glimpse of it before dropping into a small bag of biohazardous waste that he'd already pulled from a pouch on his plastic bunny suit. I guess the killer is dangling a few feet above the stack of his own victims. The forensic guys feel free to phone it in, so to speak. Shaking off my mental image of the spare finger, I brought a jar of mercury-kissed glass shards out of the van, securing it in chest, reserved for the deadliest of deadlies. I wasn't allowed to carry anything else, and transporting something so dangerous, you got to love the policy's credit solely to corporate liability ass covering. I left Kurt behind, figuring he could bring the light out while he was done with his collecting of souvenirs. He was taking his time. I remembered how unwieldy the rig had been when he had handed it down to me. So, after hanging at the van for a few minutes, I locked its doors. Another inane hazardous waste chemical policy, and went back in the house to check up on him. Descending the basement steps to its for one last time, I took a breath, drew in the smell of victory. Absolutely nothing. Then, like the killer who comes back for one last swipe at the hero, a gust of putrid wind hits me in the face, and I blink the tears away from my eyes again to see an odd shadow on the wall, tracing the outlines of a tall, slender figure, its torso spread to the ceiling as its legs stretched across the floor. The whole shape was swaying unnaturally, and I was still reeling from the unexpected lungful of noxious air which was clearing by a chill draft blowing through the concrete room. My pulse quickened as I gazed, swept across the space, scanning for a demonic intruder, but I saw nothing there. Instead, I spotted a neutral glove draped over one of the light bulb's enclosures, and two fingers dangling in front of the beam, fluttering slightly in the draft. The glove started to melt through it, smearing its halogen glare, so I yanked it away before gluing itself to the metal frame. A red smear across the glove on the palm turned out to be a message. "Thanks," it said. "No, Kurt, what the fuck?" I yelled. Cleaners pranked each other all the time on the job, but this had crossed several lines, that's for sure. I scanned the shadows again, expecting to see him doubled over in supposed laughter, but I was alone. Then I noticed the cool breeze was drifting down from the open bulkhead door up to the backyard. "How did you get that open?" I asked. The empty room, but no one reply came, sadly. "Oh, come on," I whined, hoping that Kurt would come and return to help me. After a few seconds silence, I pulled out my AA cell mag light, unplugged the halogen flood lamps, leaving myself standing in near total darkness. I held the flashlight in my teeth as I hoisted the lighting rig. both hands. Now I was wondering how was I gonna get this fucking piece of cleanbro equipment property back to the van without adequate lighter help? I wasn't exactly afraid of the dark, but I did feel kind of vulnerable trying to hide that damn thing around an unlit basement of a slash murder factory. Cue my imagination, or maybe it was just my empty stomach supplied with a spooky noise which had me moving towards a shaft of moonlight. Without help, holding the light rig out of the broad of the bulkhead door was much easier than squeezing it at the top of the staircase. With the job done, I had no other way of working lights in the basement. I figured there's no point in heading back inside. I slammed the bulkhead door shut and lunged my rig around to the front of the house, just to see Kurt's Civic backing down the driveway, pivoting and disappearing into the night. It was past our cleanbro clock out time, and my Metaclass Mercury cleanup procedure had probably made him late for a date with the bottle. But I cursed his ass for leaving me like that. I suddenly felt alone as I scented the steps one last time, locked the door, and tucked the key into a lockbox hanging from the doorknob. There were no exterior lights on, and the neighborhood was sparse and mostly dark. Finding it almost too quiet, my imagination provided me with a creep show soundtrack of movement. I was back in the van, reversing and up that drive in a dangerous clip. Given now how he left me, I feel that Kurt had no show for a fire rehab a couple days later. Instead, the office called in a pretty pothead girl who was new to the cleaning game, and I was pretty happy to show her basics. Now, that's not unusual to work with a bunch of different cleaners over the course of a month, but after a few weeks I noticed since that job, Kurt hadn't shown up. He had hardly seemed grossed out by it, but how he had thrown in the towel like that. I've seen so many newbies do their first suicide call. Usually, if you walk off the job, you walk off before you start, not after you're done. I started to wonder if Kurt had seemed a little too happy with this particular cleanup. He had been more amused than disgusted by the finger he had found. And come to think of it, he didn't toss it into the other bio waste in the van since I had the keys. The freak must have kept it. Or maybe he used it to write his fucked up love note. I started to figure that either I witnessed the inspiration of a brand new psychopath, or I was the sole guest in his retirement party. His 40-something burnout look did bear a passing resemblance to what the police had at sketch. My suspicions only grew when a couple months later, some detectives came to visit about a fraud investigation centered around Kurt. They told me something about closing his bank account after the day I'd seen him, and something about maxing his credit cards, buying easily pawned jewelry, something about finding his car abandoned at a park on the other side of the state, and something about a lack of friends or family to question. Couldn't have been much cash, officer. Go chains were Kurt's style, detective. No idea where he'd be heading. Maybe Kurt's a serial killer. I didn't suggest. That house set on the market for several more months after stagings and opening houses. But no thanks to a small part of my efforts. It sold to some family who needed room for their kids and couldn't afford a place with a zero body count and a good school district. I guess there's no such thing as ghosts, though, because they had stuck around. And, well, I did too. After I worked at cleanbro for a few more years, they had some type of scandal with a few cleaners who used small jobs to case for burglaries and big jobs for roving drug lab. It took the cops some time to figure that by then, everyone in the region knew that somebody who had been burned by the cleanbro bandits. The supply of calls began to drop off a cliff and rather wait for the axe to fall on me. One of their most reliable workers at that point, I used my way, whatever it is I learned in my community college business classes, to put out a little shingle and build a solid local brand, doing the same shit work as ever. I still had to put in the hours and get my hands dirty. A national corporate presence and a cushy executive office suite was still a long way off. But at least I was getting paid more than $9 an hour for my trouble. I actually started to like the work, watching the worst of somebody's life be vanish into a hefty bag and roll down a drain. Business boomed and town grew. The woods were chopped down and little suburban and subdivisions, corporate offices. The whole thing would disappear into a distant memory, never to be resolved, like so many of life's weird coincidences. And that's what I thought for past decades. Anyway, a few weeks ago, I was sitting at my desk when I received an odd call. The kind where the homeowner doesn't want to give any details on the phone, just an address. A bashful caller is always a bad sign, but I recognized the street name and decided to check it out for myself before fobbing off one of the 20-year-old dropouts or 40-year-old burnouts that ride my payroll onto their way of making their own mistakes. Did they trying to outrun those mistakes? They're catching up with them, maybe. It was the same house where I last worked with Kurt, and after 2 decades of working on the region, I found it pretty easy, even without my GPS-enabled smartphone. The neighborhood had grown up around it. The windows and the fresh new color paint. Never guessed it was that kind of place where a serial killer called home. The current homeowner was the oldest child of the couple that bought the house many, many years ago. He was now in his 30s, had kids of his own. Most people had forgotten the place's reputation, but something had come to light that certainly jogged many of the folks' memories. He couldn't afford to dump the house and move on, but he didn't want to stir anything up that would cause trouble for his kids at school or lead them to discover they'd been growing up in a slaughterhouse. Basically, he had been in the basement one day, poking around some old furniture that had been there as long as he had, thinking he had turned the place into a nice cozy game room or some shit. He pushed aside a wardrobe from its spot against a concrete basement wall and revealed a steel door behind it, secured with a padlock and with a healthy curiosity and a pair of bolt cutters. He got it open without stepping in to consider what the basement's dark legacy within it was, until it was far too late. A glimpse was enough to send him running to call the police. Cops found that mass grave there, sealed airtight for more than a decade by now. The coroner hauled off all the bodies, and the detective had asked their questions. Dumbfounded, the homeowner, as well as his parents, siblings, and wife, and their forensics team had scraped out a bunch of evidence. But they all seemed to be phoning it in again. Mold spores, decaying patterns indicated that a small room had been there, sealed before the family had even moved in, and these were almost certainly the uncounted victims of the homeowner's previous resident. Nobody wanted to face the embarrassment of having overlooked this much the first time. There were two funny things about it, though. If your sense of humor can abide a stack of corpses entombed now a cookie-cutter suburban development full of smiling children and friendly dogs, most of the victims have been loaded dead and dismembered, but the one on top had been hit in the head and sealed inside alive, left to suffocate on a stack of rotting bodies over the course of several hours. A fate surely worse than death, followed by, well, death. Even stranger, the cell contained an empty bucket of emergency rations that was said to be enough to package of food to keep a person alive for almost half a year. A homeowner led me down into the basement where an unholy smell awakened some long-buried memories in the back of my mind. That smell was said to have a direct line of memory, and the stench led me to recall an entire day I spent down here mopping up the leavings of some psychopath's extended wet dream. Under a weak bluish glare of the basement's LED, the homeowner pointed out the shape of a wardrobe by the wall. And my heightened memory suddenly, instantly, it recognized it. It was sitting a few feet to the left of where it had been when Kurt and I had cleaned the place out. Old spot cut into the concrete wall. There was a steel door slightly ajar, wafting a stench of hell itself into the room. Oh God, I forgot how bad it smelled down here, the homeowner said, retreating into the kitchen, leaving me alone at the bottom of the steps. A lengthy career of solvent fumes and suicide cleanups left me reasonably immune to the worst effects of bad smells. But I almost followed him anyway. God, I wish I had just followed him and called in Braden and Millick to do my dirty work, but my curiosity had the best of me. I pulled out my heavy Duracell Maglite from its loop and out of my utility belt, gripping it for safety against a I don't fucking know what, and walked over to the steel door. I checked out the wardrobe, saving the worst feet for last. My mind flashed into an image of Kurt pulling a severed finger out of its drawers with one hand, lighting his glow flickering lighter in his other. The wardrobe looked heavy, with a broad, solid feet. It probably was there to have taken a three-man team to pick up and move. Then I spotted the little telltale tracks of casters that cut into the decade's dust that had fallen since Kurt and I cleaned this place up. Looking back, I realized there had been no dust to speak of when we'd started. After the house had been supposedly unoccupied for 6 months, I gave the wardrobe a nudge. It was clear. The hulking thing hid in wheels so it can be slid around easily. And with it no longer flush against the wall, I could see a small handle bolted to its back. My attention turned to the steel door cutting into the concrete wall. standing about 4 feet tall in the corner. There was a brown smear which I could recognize as old stale blood, as if someone hit it or it hit by it very hard. A streak about a width of a fingertip had been smeared in it. It was fresh, but there was no real attempt had been made to clean it off. I inhaled deeply through my mouth, tasting unfamiliar reek, and held my breath. Then pulled the handle. Inside was exactly what I imagined. Plenty of caked on, congealed, decaying blood, and little mid-scripts of debris coating the stone walls of the floor in a 4-foot cell. Nothing that was shocking after a long on the job. The space was tucked under the house's front door landing, easily missed protrusion from the other lines were tagging our foundation. I leaned in with my flashlight, then looked closer to see something found to understand. Brown smudges on the wall had been illegible writing or feeble attempts to shift stones. Someone had spent their last moments awake and alive in here. The final movement in a madman's symphony, and suddenly that was all I wanted to know. I let my breath out with a sigh, started back. That's when my 1,000 looms of magnite brilliance caught something bright in the corner of the concrete cell, tucked in by a jamb of the door. I focused on it with my beam, taking the moment to resolve soft edge rectangular shape and recognize it for what it was. An orange zippo lighter. Its lid hinged from soot from burning until it ran out of fuel.